Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of ancient Rome's more unusual professions, the orgy planner. Yes, someone had to schedule the wine, supervise the grapes, organize the entertainment, and make sure no one accidentally brought their mother-in-law. It might sound absurd, even decadent, but Roman feasting culture wasn't just about indulgence. It was about power, status, networking, and, well, quite a bit of nudity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyes open before sunrise, not because you're disciplined, because you're anxious. You're the planner of tonight's elite Roman orgy, which means your brain has already conjured 17 things that could go wrong before breakfast. Your sleeping mat is still warm, your tunic is wrinkled, and someone has already shoved a scroll under your door. It crackles ominously. You unroll it with the grim resolve of a soldier reading his draft notice. It's from your patron's wife, who would like to remind you that last time the rose petals were yellow, not red, and guests noticed. You haven't even touched your barley yet. Outside, Rome is just waking up. But you're already juggling flaming amphorae in your mind. Today's guest list includes senators, artists, philosophers, 2 courtesans who hate each other, and, rumour has it, someone from the imperial family. Of course, no one tells you who. Could be a cousin. Could be Caligula. Either way, you'll be blamed if someone's peacock isn't sufficiently massaged. You step into your sandals and begin the day like any good Roman orgy planner, with dread and a clipboard. First order of business? Staffing. You sent runners yesterday to book flute girls, dancers, a harpist, and a man who walks on his hands while balancing a tray of figs on his feet. None have confirmed. You suspect at least 2 are currently drunk in the Subura. Then there's the food. You've requested oysters, honey-roasted dormice, figs, dates, olives, and several questionable meats from the eastern provinces. Everything must arrive fresh, or at least freshish. 1 bad oyster, and half the forum will be whispering that you poisoned Senator Gaius. Oh, and don't forget the cushions. Last time, one of the divans collapsed under a toga-heavy magistrate, and the fallout was political. This time, the couches must be sturdy enough to handle whatever happens on them. And you know exactly what happens on them. The sun is barely up, and you're already sweating into your linen. You take a breath. You remind yourself, you are a professional, a maestro of madness, a choreographer of chaos. It's going to be a long day, but the cushions will be fluffed, the wine will be poured, and the guests will never know how close you came to screaming. Not yet, anyway. It's still early, and already you're unrolling a fresh scroll, today's updated guest list. You read it slowly, bracing for disaster. It's not a seating chart. It's a delicately balanced social powder keg with olives on top. Lucius Calpurnius Piso is attending, naturally. He comes to everything and always insists on reclining in the centre couch, preferably next to someone else's wife. Problem is, his wife, Aurelia, is also coming. She wasn't invited, but that's never stopped her before. You make a note. Separate couches, separate wine sauces, and definitely no harp solos while they're both in the room. Last time, she threw a garum jug. Next, Senator Petronius Arbiter has accepted. A witty man, a dangerous man, known for his tongue, and not always in a poetic sense. You'll need to seat him far from Junius Blasus, whose poetry Petronius once described as a slow death written in metre. Then you spot it. Domitianus and 2 guests, unnamed. The vagueness is offensive. Could be respected clients, could be gladiators, could be a giraffe in a toga. You write flexible seating, West End, and move on. Now for the entertainers, 4 flute girls, 3 dancers, and the mime twins. That's already one more performer than Lucullus approves of. He considers mimes barbaric, His mistress, however, finds them delightful, and he finds his mistress's approval critical to his reputation. The guest list isn't just a set of names, it's a living map of ancient Roman tension. Politics, power, lust, family feuds, and vendettas, all reclining together on silk-covered couches, drinking from the same communal bowl of wine. And of course the real terror, someone important who wasn't invited. You can already hear the whispered accusations. It was intentional, a public insult. I'll never lend him my bath slaves again. You roll up the scroll. You make a new one. You draw arrows, add warnings, circle names. You're not planning a party. You're managing a live diplomatic simulation with aphrodisiacs and roasted dormice. Still, you've done this before. You'll do it again. You just hope, this time, no one stabs anyone over couch placement. Not like last spring. With the guest list finalised, or at least stable enough not to implode, it's time for the next crisis. Provisioning. Planning a Roman orgy isn't about pouring wine and lighting torches. It's about curating a menu so decadent it makes the gods feel underdressed. Your list is already 3 tablets long. Let's start with the basics. Wine. Not just any wine, it must be Falernian, aged and expensive enough to make your sponsor wince. You write 3 amphorae Falernian, 2 of Cacuban for show, 1 of vinegar to serve to the guests who arrive late. Next, oysters, imported fresh from Baiae. Must be alive when they arrive, or at least convincingly moist. You send a note to the seafood vendor reminding him that last time, half the oysters were already dead, and one guest declared it an omen. He's still recovering. Then there's honey-roasted dormice, a staple of Roman decadence. Rolled in poppy seeds and dipped in honey, they must be plump, not stringy. You ask for 50. You'll receive 35. Half will still twitch. You add roasted peacock, stuffed sow's udder, dates from Judea, figs from Carthage, and cheese wrapped in vine leaves. You also scribble down a reminder, no garum accidents near the bread this time. The last event's anchovy-scented rolls nearly caused a riot. For dessert, you'll need candied nuts, almond cakes, and some sort of visual spectacle, perhaps a cake shaped like the Colosseum, filled with live songbirds. You'll figure out the baking logistics later. Then comes the perfume budget: myrrh, rose oil, saffron water. Enough incense to make a Vestal Virgin dizzy. You make a note. Discreetly scent the latrines. You stare at the list. It looks more like a military requisition than a menu, and it costs more than a decent villa outside Ostia. But this is Rome. Opulence is expected. Gluttony is style. And your patron's reputation depends on guests being too stunned by luxury to notice that the music is out of tune and someone spilled wine on the marble lions. You hand the scroll to your fastest runner with strict instructions. No substitutions, no apologies. And if he forgets the sugared grapes again, I'm feeding him to the flamingos. Time to pray to Mercury, god of commerce and delivery. Let's clear something up right away. A vomitorium isn't what you think it is. No, Romans didn't build special rooms just to purge mid-feast and make room for more peacock. That's a later myth, probably invented by someone who watched Romans eat and couldn't imagine another explanation. The vomitorium, in reality, refers to the entrance and exit passages in Roman amphitheatres, where crowds spewed out after events. But that doesn't stop modern imaginations from picturing marble-tiled throw-up lounges filled with perfumed nobles and feather fans. That said, Romans did overindulge, and if a guest quietly excused themselves to step out and refresh, no one asked questions. So as an orgy planner, it's your job to make sure the entire venue, from atrium to triclinium to discreet garden alcove, is ready to absorb the consequences of excess, in style. You begin the inspection. The banquet hall floors must gleam. Mosaic tiles, especially the part with Bacchus riding a panther, need a quick polish. You personally remove a grape stem stuck in the grout from last week's gathering. You know your standards. The latrines are cleaned, perfumed, and stocked with fresh sponges on sticks. The lemon-scented vinegar is refreshed. A candle burns gently near the doorway, not for light, for dignity. Out in the courtyard, you double-check the fountain basins. Guests have a habit of reclining too far and toppling in after their fifth goblet. Last time, a general's wife nearly drowned in the koi pond. You've since removed the koi. You can't remove the wife. You pass through the perfume room, where oils and salves are arranged like an apothecary for indulgence. Rose, cinnamon, myrrh. You sample one, and your wrist smells like a love letter to Venus. Perfect. Next, you inspect the vomitorium myth room. That is, a quiet hallway with a curtain, a chair, a bronze basin, and a polite slave stationed with a fan. It's not called that, of course. It's called the retreat. But everyone knows what it's for, and it too must sparkle. Clean, scented, and luxurious. No matter how indulgent things get tonight, no one leaves this party feeling undignified. If they do purge, they'll do it surrounded by polished marble and tasteful murals of satyrs. That's your promise. It's mid-morning, and it's time for the most delicate part of your job. Not selecting wines, not managing nobles, but addressing the staff. A Roman feast of this magnitude requires people. Lots of people. And none of them woke up today hoping to be part of another nobleman's indulgent fever dream. You gather the team in the atrium, 23 bodies, each with a role. Most are slaves, some born in the household, some bought for the specific purpose of carrying trays, pouring wine, or looking attractive while silent. A few are paid performers. All are stressed. First up, cupbearers. You assign them their zones: central triclinium, periphery lounge, west garden. Dilute the strong wine unless told otherwise, you remind them. Some guests think they can handle full Falernian. They cannot. Fan bearers are next, a crucial role. Their timing can make or break a guest's comfort. One gust too strong and you've blown out a candle or exposed someone's secrets. One too weak and someone sweats into a silk cushion. Neither is acceptable. Fruit attendants, yes, they're a thing, are instructed to refresh trays constantly, peel grapes only upon request, and discreetly remove any fruit that begins to resemble a raisin. Then there are the musicians, already bickering about tempo. You separate the flute girl from the lyre player. Last time, their disagreement turned into a duet so awkward the guests stopped mid-feast to offer them marriage counselling. The dancers, all oil and eyeliner, lean dramatically against a pillar, pretending not to listen. You run through their cues anyway. No improvisation, you say sharply. We are not reliving the Bacchic fire incident. You make eye contact with the youngest slave, a boy no older than 10, who's responsible for collecting discarded sandals. You nod once. He nods back. A silent pact is made. He will not fail you. Finally, you give your usual speech. Tonight, you are invisible unless summoned. You are silent unless spoken to. You are grace, rhythm, and elegance incarnate. Or I swear by Jupiter, I will assign you to sponge duty until Saturnalia. There's a pause. Then a collective nod. Briefings are complete. You take a breath. The human engine behind Roman debauchery is oiled, powdered, and aligned. For now. It happens every time. The invitations go out, the wine arrives, the silk cushions are plumped, and just when you begin to feel marginally in control, someone hurries into the atrium, out of breath, with that familiar look. The musicians haven't arrived. Of course they haven't. You grit your teeth. You specifically booked a flute girl, 2 cithara players, and 1 backup aulos duo in case of exactly this situation. And yet, here you are, staring down the barrel of silence at a party where silence is considered a civic offence. You send your most reliable runner to the Subura district, Rome's chaotic marketplace of noise, smells, and bad decisions. Find them, you instruct, alive, conscious, and dressed. You don't even ask why they're late. You already know. They're either still asleep, too drunk to walk, or tangled in a romantic entanglement that began at last night's Saturnalia rehearsal and never stopped. The dancers are now complaining that without musicians, they can't rehearse. The poets are delighted, assuming this means more stage time. You quickly squash that idea. No one wants Gaius's ode to his mother's third marriage recited at a party where people are eating sugared dormice. You consider contingency plans. The house cook knows 2 songs on a cracked reed pipe. A nearby slave has a decent singing voice if kept off the wine. Worst case? You hum in rhythm while someone shakes a jar of lentils. You pray it doesn't come to that. Then, like ghosts emerging from incense, the musicians appear, fashionably dishevelled, vaguely apologetic, and smelling faintly of spikenard and poor decisions. One of the flute girls is missing a sandal. The other looks as though she's had her heart broken by at least 3 senators. Still, they're here. You assign their stations. One in the atrium, one near the main dining hall, one in the garden for ambience. You stress. No dramatic tempo shifts, no dirges, no impromptu solos unless someone's actually dying. They nod. Sort of. You exhale. Crisis averted. For now. But you keep your eye on the lyre player. He's tuning it slowly, lovingly. Far too lovingly for someone who isn't about to ruin everything with an improvised love ballad. You make a note. Station him near the door. Easy removal. If music is the soul of the party, seating is the strategy. You're not just placing guests on couches, you're navigating rivalries, romances, and enough unspoken tension to collapse a marble villa. The Roman triclinium, the classic 3-couch setup, seats 9. Technically, comfortably, closer to 7 if no one brings their pet leopard. You begin by sketching it all out on a wax tablet, muttering to yourself like a general planning a siege. Center couch, that's where the status goes. The summus locus, the place of honor, is reserved for the guest of highest rank. Unfortunately, 2 people think they're that person. Senator Piso and Governor Crispus both claim the title by birth, marriage, and sheer self-confidence. You'll need to decide who gets the top spot and who gets mildly poisoned wine. You also need to keep lovers near each other, but not too near, unless they're ex-lovers, in which case they must be divided by an entire bowl of olives and someone charming but very boring in between. Then there are the seat fillers, charming but forgettable citizens who exist to keep the peace. You place a wealthy equestrian next to a dramatic poet to absorb the impact. The equestrian won't understand the poem, and the poet will love the attention. It's a symbiotic arrangement. You assign courtesans to strategic locations, near the lonely, the rich, or the recently divorced. You also assign 2 of them to the west side, not because it matters, but because it will bother Aurelia, and she needs something to complain about other than the wine temperature. Of course, you leave room for unpredictability. Someone will arrive uninvited. Someone will switch seats to make a statement. Someone will spill wine and demand a full reshuffling. You leave a few empty cushions, plausible deniability, last-minute flexibility, and a place for the poet to sulk if needed. With the seating plan finished, you admire your work like a sculptor regarding his marble, knowing full well someone will hit it with a hammer before sunset. You roll up the scroll and hand it off with this instruction. Place name tags in wax, and for the love of Jupiter, don't let anyone switch them. You know they will, but at least you tried. If the orgy is a performance, the kitchen is the backstage arena, and it smells like fire, figs, and utter panic. By mid-afternoon, the entire household is a choreography of controlled culinary chaos. The main cook, a former naval cook turned domestic warlord, is already shouting at a terrified assistant over the proper stuffing ratio for roasted dormice. You hear the words, honey, poppy seeds, and I will personally throw you into the Tiber. Excellent. Everything's on schedule. The main attraction tonight? Peacock, roasted whole, feathers reapplied for dramatic flair. It looks magnificent, tastes like shoe leather, and is mostly served so rich guests can brag about chewing something that had once strutted like a diva. The kitchen is also prepping a pig, which has been stuffed with live birds. Yes, that's a real thing. You roast the pig, slice it open at the table, and surprise, doves fly out. It's impressive, unsettling, and only mildly traumatic for the doves. Platters of figs, dates, and honey cakes line the counters. A pastry shaped like the Colosseum is being glazed. A slave accidentally eats part of it. He's promptly reassigned to grape-fetching duty. In one corner, someone's stirring a vat of garum, that infamous Roman fish sauce made from fermented anchovies and the tears of anyone within sniffing range. You remind them loudly to keep it away from the bread. One garum-soaked loaf ruined last month's affair and started a 5-day feud between two magistrates. Meanwhile, the wine storage is being arranged. Amphorae of Falernian for the main guests, cheaper vintages for those who won't know the difference. You make sure the amphorae are labelled subtly. You've been burned before, literally, by an angry consul with a sensitive palate. Every corner of the kitchen hums with tension. Platters being polished, sauces reduced, meats larded, and pastry horns filled with mystery. You're everywhere at once, sniffing, tasting, directing. You're not just managing a meal, you're managing an edible spectacle that's expected to impress, intoxicate, and survive being hurled during an argument. As you walk past the oven, the head cook barks, "If anyone drops another dormouse, I'm feeding them to the peacock." You nod. Things are going well. You'd think selecting a scent would be easy, but in ancient Rome, perfume is a statement, and tonight's orgy is no place for amateur olfactory choices. The guests won't just taste and see opulence, they need to smell it. The air must reek of wealth, temptation, and the kind of confidence only achievable by people who bathe in imported rose oil. So you descend into the storage chamber, where tiny alabaster jars line the shelves like sacred relics. Myrrh from Arabia, cinnamon oil from Ceylon, saffron from Cilicia, and an experimental blend called Essence of Nile Lotus, which smells like an expensive pond. You've sniffed everyone. Twice. You begin composing the fragrance strategy like a battle plan. The atrium will smell of citrus and cedarwood, sharp, fresh, a clean opening note. The main triclinium? That's for heavier scents. Myrrh, frankincense, a touch of musk. It should whisper, "You might make a mistake tonight, and that's okay." The private garden alcoves, where secrets will be exchanged and togas will be strategically misplaced, get the seductive blend. Rose, cinnamon, and just enough spikenard to make someone faint if they stand too close. Then there's the perfumed oils for guests' hands and feet. You assign an attendant to warm them slightly. No one wants cold oil. Cold oil is for barbarians. Warm oil is for seduction and good lighting. And yes, you've scented the latrines too. You're not a barbarian either. You instruct your staff, don't overscent. We want luxury, not suffocation. If a senator walks in and blames the smell for his nosebleed, we've gone too far. One of the dancers requests a personal scent, something hypnotic. You give her a blend so potent it once caused a minor riot during a Saturnalia feast. You warn her. She smiles. She'll use it anyway. You walk through the halls, trailing your nose like a trained hound. The atmosphere is beginning to bloom, warm, spiced, opulent. A perfumed breeze wafts through the triclinium like a whispered secret. You nod. This is what indulgence smells like. Scented, lit, and fully armed with aroma, the house is nearly ready to receive its guests. All it needs now is chaos. It's late afternoon. The air smells of warm citrus, roasted meat, and very expensive decisions. You've assigned every task, threatened everyone necessary, and bribed the harpist to stay sober until at least dessert. Now comes the moment of truth, the final walkthrough. You start at the entrance, where oil lamps are being lit one by one. They flicker gently across polished marble, casting a golden glow that says, "You're not poor, not tonight." A flower boy sprinkles fresh petals at the threshold. You remind him not to overdo it. Last time, someone slipped on lavender and sued, into the atrium. The bronze fountains are running. Grapes are pyramided in absurdly impractical displays. Pillows have been beaten, fluffed, and positioned with unnatural symmetry. You move one slightly to make it look less staged. It's important that decadence feels effortless, even if it's taken 32 hours and 2 minor breakdowns to achieve. Next, the triclinium, the main event space. Tables are low, recliners are perfectly angled. Each cushion has been dusted, perfumed, and strategically rotated to hide any wine stains from last month's senator's birthday disaster. You do a bounce test, soft enough to comfort, firm enough to survive. Activity. You inspect the tableware, silver goblets, bronze platters, blown glass amphorae. Bread is artfully arranged. Cheese is sweating slightly, but you decide it adds authenticity. You quietly remove a beetle from a fig. No one saw. It never happened. In the garden alcoves, the lighting is soft and ambiguous, just dim enough to be flattering, just bright enough to avoid accidents involving potted plants and dignity. A servant fans incense. The effect is ethereal. You pause and let yourself enjoy it, briefly. You spot a small detail. A flower out of place. You fix it. Another. A curtain that's not quite even. You adjust it. A final check. You inhale deeply. You listen. You walk through the space like a guest. It's beautiful. Ridiculous. Excessive. Perfect. You sigh. For a moment, you let yourself believe it's all under control. Then someone rushes in. The guest of honor has arrived early, and he brought 3 extra wives. Of course he did. You smile tightly, straighten your tunic, and step into the fray. The first knock is not so much a knock as it is a dramatic thump followed by laughter. You take a breath. Here we go. The door opens. A slave pulls back the curtain with just enough flourish to impress, but not overshadow. Your first guest, Lucius Calpurnius Piso, strolls in like he owns the place, despite not paying for any of it. He smells of strong wine, ambition, and imported cologne that cost more than a soldier's annual wage. He greets you with a grin and a wink. Tonight, my friend, we make Bacchus blush. Behind him, a trail of courtesans, a minor poet, and a man carrying a small lyre who may or may not be invited. You decide not to check. Guests begin pouring in. Flowing robes, gold-threaded tunics, embroidered sandals, and expressions of affected boredom. They've all arrived early to show they're important, and they've all had at least one drink to show they're relaxed. You mentally recalibrate the wine rations. A slave offers perfumed towels. Another presents rosewater. One guest refuses both and instead demands a small amphora of something more Dionysian. You give him spiced wine. He calls it intellectual. You don't correct him. The garden fills with murmurs, introductions, judgments, hushed conversations that are somehow louder than actual conversation. Someone's already asked where the flute girls are. Someone else is eyeing the fruit pile like it owes them money. You keep moving, nodding, adjusting. You separate 2 senators who haven't spoken since the goat insult incident. You notice that Governor Crispus is reclining far too close to someone else's wife, and that the poets are gathering in a corner like storm clouds. One of the dancers strays too early into the center. You snap your fingers. Not yet. Timing matters. If everything begins too soon, it loses mystery. If it begins too late, guests complain. You want suspense. You want smoldering scandal. You pass a serving tray, discreetly pluck a grape, and keep walking. You spot one guest already snoring on a cushion, another polishing a dagger with butter. So yes, it's going well. For a Roman orgy, controlled chaos is the highest compliment. And tonight, you're almost insulted. The lyres are tuned. The flute girls are finally sober, or at least balanced, and the dancers are oiling their limbs like they're about to go into battle. You give the nod. The entertainment begins. A hush falls over the triclinium as the first dancer steps forward, golden veils flowing, anklets chiming, eyes fixed somewhere between divine inspiration and complete apathy. She begins to move. It's graceful, hypnotic, and exactly the level of theatrical sensuality that makes elderly senators feel poetic. The flute joins in, slow, spiraling notes that float through the perfumed air like incense. For a brief, beautiful moment, the entire feast slips into rhythm. Chewing slows, conversations hush. Even the poet stops trying to recite. But then, of course, something goes off script. A guest demands a reenactment of the myth of Leda and the Swan. Another counters, no, Orpheus in the underworld, with real torches this time. A third suggests something involving naked gladiators, a water jug, and interpretive juggling. You smile politely and assure them it's all part of the plan. Meanwhile, the mime twins, who were specifically told to wait until the third wine course, enter early and begin miming an exaggerated scene of seduction involving a fig and a sausage. Half the room laughs. The other half looks confused. One man applauds like it's the theatre of Pompey. You resist the urge to pour wine directly into your eyes. The dances continue. The musicians try to adapt. You spot the harpist improvising something mournful, possibly because she's just realised she's playing in the wrong key. Then someone throws a peach. At first it seems accidental, but then another guest throws a fig back. Now it's participatory. You step in quickly, raise your hand, and declare it a symbolic offering to Bacchus. Everyone cheers. Crisis averted. You make a note to never serve throwable fruit again. The entertainment surges forward. Music, movement, whispers, laughter. A flame dancer performs near the pool. A flute girl stumbles. A guest proposes to a statue. It's chaos. Gorgeous, perfumed, theatrical chaos. And this is where you shine. Orgy planner, stage manager, mood wrangler, fig diplomat. You adjust a lamp, nod to a server, and glide silently through the shadows, as if any of this was intentional. By the third course, the wine is no longer being served. It's being worshipped. The guests, draped across their couches like tipsy gods, are in full bloom, laughing too loudly, flirting too boldly, and forgetting basic facts like who they came with. You've instructed the servers to strategically dilute the wine. Falernian is strong. One amphora can convince a senator to sing poetry or confess to tax fraud. You water down the wine for the ambitious and leave it pure for the already hopeless. It's diplomacy by the jug. The conversations grow less philosophical, more personal. A young patrician loudly compares his wealth to Jupiter's. A merchant brags about owning 3 villas and a camel. A woman in pearls whispers a joke about the emperor's feet. You pretend not to hear. If she gets exiled, you'll miss her. She's great with seating arrangements. Across the hall, a poet is trying to seduce a philosopher using verse that sounds suspiciously plagiarized. You walk past just in time to hear, "Your eyes are like olives, dark and briny." You do not intervene. Meanwhile, 2 courtesans are locked in a passive-aggressive compliment battle. Each smile is a dagger. Each laugh carries the scent of strategic murder. One gifts the other a fig. You take a mental note. Remove all figs by dessert. And of course, in the back corner, someone has decided to start a drinking game involving gladiator trivia. "Name 3 famous duels or drink," someone shouts. A minor senator tries to fake his way through an answer. He's booed. He drinks. He collapses gently into a pillow and begins quoting Virgil. In the garden, a guest is giving a speech. He believes he's being profound. He's actually just explaining how many slaves it takes to keep a marble fountain clean. No one stops him. It's tradition. The wine flows faster now. Amphorae are opened like promises. Cups are never empty. Boundaries blur. Names are forgotten. Stories are exaggerated. The orgy part of the orgy is inching closer. And still, you monitor the flow like a seasoned general. You adjust lighting. You slow the music. You stop a guest from drinking perfume. The orgy is heating up. And the scandals, they're just beginning to simmer. By this point in the evening, the party has transitioned from structured decadence to unstructured mythological nonsense. Guests have stopped using names. Titled senators are referring to each other as Apollo, Venus, or that guy with the peacocks. Someone has fashioned a laurel wreath out of table herbs. You spot 3 people in the fountain. One appears to be trying to baptize the others. You decide not to ask. This is the moment where most hosts would panic. But you sip watered wine calmly and begin quiet damage control. The gladiator wrestling reenactment has moved dangerously close to the mosaic of Neptune. You reroute them gently, offering a tray of dates as distraction. It works. They fall for it like toddlers with tattoos. You notice 2 guests missing. You find them under the table, arguing about stoicism while rubbing each other's feet. You cough discreetly. They nod and pretend to be looking for a lost bracelet. In the west alcove, the flute girl has burst into tears. A guest asked if her instrument was tuned, which she interpreted as a metaphor for something else entirely. You send over the backup lyre player and a complimentary handful of pomegranate seeds. She recovers. In the atrium, a very large man is attempting to seduce a marble bust of Venus. He's whispering sweet nothings and slowly feeding it olives. You send a servant to gently turn the bust away to avoid scandal. The man takes it as a challenge and begins reciting love poetry. You allow it. Frankly, it's better than his earlier conversation about grain tariffs. Someone knocks over a torch. You catch it before it hits the tapestry. You do not flinch, you do not sweat. You are the still center in a storm of satin, grapes, and moral compromise. You walk the room like a high priest of excess, adjusting, smoothing, redirecting, a hand on a shoulder, a look across the room, a raised brow that says, "Don't throw that goblet, Cassius." He puts it down. He knows better. This is your art, your chaos, and you've tamed it, just enough. But it's not over yet. You hear the distinct sound of someone riding a wine cart down the hallway. You take another sip. It's almost dawn. Dawn breaks with all the subtlety of a dropped amphora. Sunlight creeps across the marble floors, illuminating the carnage. Overturned goblets, a sandal stuck in a fruit bowl, and a nobleman sleeping face down in a decorative urn. The oil lamps are sputtering out. The perfume has faded into something resembling regret. You step carefully over a passed-out flute player and begin your final round of damage assessment. The cushions are askew. Several togas are draped across statues in ways that could qualify as art or evidence. Someone wrote a philosophical limerick on the wall in wine. It doesn't rhyme, but it is surprisingly insightful. You find your way to the triclinium. A pile of olives has been arranged into a crude likeness of the emperor. You consider preserving it, then quietly kick it under the table. The slaves begin the silent ritual of post-orgy cleanup. Wine-stained linens are bundled up. Half-eaten peacocks are carted off. Incense ashes swept into neat, dignified piles. You give instructions in a hushed voice, as though speaking too loudly might awaken the deeper chaos. You check on the guest list. Everyone accounted for. No deaths. 1 sprained ankle. 2 spontaneous marriages. 1 very polite note left by a departing philosopher that simply reads, "Thank you. I've learned things I must never speak of." You make a list titled Debrief. It includes, never serve throwable fruit. Do not allow live poetry battles near open flames. Keep Venus statue in storage during future events. Seat Crispus far from anyone with legal representation. Someone groans loudly from under a table. You nod in acknowledgement but offer no help. The party is over. Everyone must face their own consequences. In the garden, doves are still wandering from the pig-burst performance. You gently herd them into a corner and throw them some leftover candied almonds. They deserve something sweet after the evening they've endured. You take one last look around. It was a mess, a triumph, a diplomatic nightmare with grapes. And you survived it. You retire to your room, kick off your sandals, and collapse onto your mat. No applause, no awards. just the knowledge that no one saw the chaos, because you absorbed it. Tomorrow, they'll tell stories about how perfect it was. You'll just sleep. Started with a whisper of wind, dry, crackling, bitter. The soil of the Great Plains, once black and rich, had turned to powder, and now that powder took flight. Farmers who once danced in golden wheat fields stood helpless as their land, their future, quite literally blew away. The 1930s weren't kind to anyone, but for families from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and eastern Colorado, the land itself became the enemy. They had trusted the soil. That was the tragedy. Encouraged by government incentives and promises of prosperity, thousands of families had ploughed up native grasses to make way for row after row of wheat. But they weren't told that those native grasses were the only thing holding the land in place. And when the rains stopped in 1931, they didn't return. Year after year, the drought deepened. Without roots, the topsoil had nothing to hold it down. It began to lift, carried away by the wind in ever-thickening clouds. The storms came suddenly. One moment, the sky was blue. The next, it was black, as if night had fallen in the middle of the day. Walls of dust hundreds of feet high swallowed entire towns. Livestock suffocated. Cars stalled. Children developed dust pneumonia. Mothers sealed windows with wet towels and stuffed newspaper into the cracks of doors, but the dust still crept in, coating dishes, furniture, lungs. People started calling it the Dust Bowl. On April 14, 1935, forever known as Black Sunday, a storm so massive swept across the plains that some believed the world was ending. A preacher in Oklahoma reportedly told his congregation to go home and prepare for judgment. That storm stretched for over 200 miles, blotted out the sun, and turned day to darkness for thousands. And with it came a realization. They couldn't stay. The soil was gone. The crops were gone. The livestock were dying. Children were coughing up dirt. What was once a land of hope had become a graveyard of dreams. And so, with battered pickup trucks, jalopies held together with wire, and everything they owned strapped to the roof, families turned west, toward California, toward survival, towards something, anything better than this. They didn't yet know what waited for them on the other side, but they knew what they were running from, and it was gaining on them. The road west wasn't paved with gold, it was paved with desperation. As the Dust Bowl ravaged the plains, an exodus unlike any other in American history began. Families piled into rickety Fords and Chevrolets, often with 4 flat tires and more children than seats. Everything they had, mattresses, kettles, washboards, and heirlooms, was lashed down with rope. Their destination was a dream: California. Route 66 became the artery of escape. It stretched from the Dust Bowl states to the Pacific, winding through New Mexico, Arizona, and into California's Central Valley. For many, it wasn't just a road, it was a lifeline. Towns along the route swelled with migrants, camps sprang up near gas stations, and any rest stop with running water became a temporary home. They came by the thousands. An estimated 2.5 million people fled the southern plains during the 1930s. Most were small-time farmers, sharecroppers, and field hands. They left behind mortgages they couldn't pay, fields they couldn't save, and homes they could no longer live in. Many never looked back. Others wept as they crossed the state line. But California wasn't the promised land they had imagined. Newspaper ads had promised farm jobs and lush fields, but the reality was far harsher. By the time most migrants arrived, the Great Depression had already choked off much of the economy. Work was scarce, and wages were lower than survival required. At the state border, California Highway Patrol officers began turning people away if they looked too poor. Derogatorily nicknamed Okies, regardless of whether they were actually from Oklahoma, these migrants were viewed with suspicion and often outright hostility. Locals feared they'd bring crime, disease, or worse, competition for scarce jobs. Still, the travelers pressed on. In makeshift camps called Hoovervilles, named after President Hoover, who many blamed for their plight. They slept under tarps and cardboard. In the fields, they picked peaches, grapes, cotton, whatever was in season. Their children worked beside them, often in the blazing heat. A day's pay might buy a little bread, maybe beans. And yet, even through hunger and humiliation, they carried hope. Hope that the next field would pay better. That California would eventually deliver on its dream. That the road, however long and dusty, led somewhere better. Because to turn back wasn't just impossible, it meant surrender. And none of them were ready to do that. Once in California, the dust didn't follow them, but the hardship did. For the thousands of families who arrived seeking a better life, what they found instead were crowded, unsanitary migrant camps and a cold welcome from the locals. Entire communities of tents, shacks, and makeshift huts sprang up on the outskirts of towns and orchards. These were not homes, they were survival zones. Families crammed into shelters made from salvaged wood, tin scraps, cardboard, and canvas. There was little privacy. Water came from communal pumps. Toilets were often nothing more than dugout pits, shared by dozens. Illness spread fast. Malnutrition weakened the old and the young. Babies cried for milk. Parents prayed for work. The air might have been cleaner than Oklahoma's, but the mood was still suffocating. Tensions simmered. Local Californians saw the migrants as a threat. They feared that the flood of desperate laborers would undercut wages, and they were right. Growers could now offer pennies for back-breaking fieldwork, knowing that someone, somewhere, would be desperate enough to take it. And so, wages plummeted. Conditions worsened. Exploitation became the norm. Sometimes the migrants' only refuge came from the federal government. The Farm Security Administration, FSA, created a handful of labor camps, like the one in Arvin, California, offering sanitation, medical care, and basic dignity. These government camps were different. Organized, clean, even democratic. Residents elected committees and settled disputes internally. But there weren't enough of them. Most families lived outside this safety net, in the informal, lawless settlements that ringed the agricultural valleys. They were often harassed by police, driven out of towns by angry mobs, or forced to keep moving to avoid detection. Local authorities labelled them vagrants. Some children were denied schooling. Others were too sick, or too busy working in the fields, to attend. And yet inside these camps, a culture of resilience grew. People played guitars around campfires. They told stories. They shared food. They sang. Songs like Hard Travelin' and Do Re Mi gave voice to their pain and their perseverance. These weren't just sad ballads, they were anthems of survival. Because even when life stripped them of land, home, and security, they still clung to community. And with community came strength. They were poor, but they were not broken. And slowly, something powerful began to grow amid the hunger: solidarity. For the children of Dust Bowl migrants, childhood was not a time of play. It was a daily exercise in endurance. Their toys were often sticks. Their games played in dirt lots beside roadside camps, and their classrooms were fields of crops. The Great Depression had already strained America's youth, but for these children, poverty came with an extra layer of dust and displacement. They weren't shielded from the struggle. They were part of it. Even young children worked alongside their parents, stooping to pick cotton, grapes, or beans for a few cents a day. Some were as young as 6, their small fingers blistered and raw by the end of each shift. School was a luxury. Constant relocation meant constant interruption. By the time they enrolled in a new school, it was time to move again. And if they made it to school at all, they were often unwelcome. Labelled Okie kids, they were mocked by peers and sometimes even by teachers. Their clothing, patched, sun-bleached, and often shared between siblings, marked them instantly. Their accents, their dust-bitten skin, their silence born of hunger, they all set them apart. Some schools refused to enroll them altogether. Others required them to clean toilets before attending class. Yet amid the adversity, these children developed an uncommon grit. They learned to care for younger siblings while their parents worked. They carried jugs of water to the fields, fixed broken shoes with scraps of rubber, and helped stretch meals made of beans, cornmeal, and lard. Despite the odds, there were small triumphs. Relief agencies occasionally provided books, soap, and even makeshift schools. In the rare government camps with stability, children could laugh, read, and learn, if only for a little while. It wasn't much, but for a child who had lived through dust storms, hunger, and homelessness, it was a start. Some grew up to remember these years, not just as ones of deprivation, but of togetherness. Families, though poor, were tightly knit. Storytelling, music, and shared chores created bonds that lasted lifetimes. The children might not have had toys or birthdays or summer vacations, but they had one another. And as they grew, many carried that resilience into adulthood, becoming the first in their families to find stable jobs, finish high school, or join the military in the coming war. They were children of dust, yes, but also children of determination. As the Dust Bowl migrants toiled in California's fields and camps, their stories didn't vanish. They transformed into song. Music became both a comfort and a weapon, a way to preserve dignity and protest injustice when words alone weren't enough. In the rhythm of guitar strings and the verses of folk ballads, the pain, pride, and perseverance of the migrants came alive. Nowhere was this more visible than in the music of Woody Guthrie. A native Oklahoman himself, Guthrie became the voice of the displaced. He travelled alongside migrants, slept in the same camps, and picked in the same fields. What he saw, he sang. His songs weren't abstract. They named real places, real struggles, real heartbreak. Do Re Mi, for example, warned hopeful migrants that California wasn't the paradise they had imagined. California is a Garden of Eden, a paradise to live in or see, but believe it or not, you won't find it so hot if you ain't got the do-re-mi. Guthrie's songs echoed through dusty camps, played on battered guitars, harmonicas, or simply sung aloud. They were passed from tent to tent, worker to worker. These weren't just melodies, they were oral history. They reminded listeners they weren't alone. They turned shared pain into collective strength. But Guthrie wasn't the only one. Across the camps, migrants created their own songs about lost farms, cruel foremen, the long road west, or hopes for a better tomorrow. These songs told the truth when newspapers didn't, when politicians wouldn't. They spoke of exploitation, hunger, police harassment, and broken dreams, but also of love, faith, and resistance. This music influenced the rising American folk scene and became part of a larger cultural shift. It exposed listeners beyond California to the harsh reality of life for Dust Bowl refugees. It built empathy. It planted seeds of activism. Over time, these songs helped fuel support for reform. They humanized statistics. They pierced through indifference. They challenged the narrative that the migrants were lazy or unwanted. In melody, they proved otherwise. Because when the land failed, and the work was cruel, and the people were hostile, there was still the music. It fed souls when bodies starved. It gave voice to the voiceless. And it reminded every man, woman, and child beneath a canvas roof, you matter, you belong, you endure. The migrants had their songs, but they also found a voice in literature, one that would echo far beyond the camps and fields. That voice belonged to John Steinbeck, a California native who witnessed the Dust Bowl migration firsthand and transformed the plight of the displaced into one of the most powerful novels in American history, The Grapes of Wrath. Published in 1939, The Grapes of Wrath followed the fictional Joad family, Okies from Oklahoma, as they made the harrowing journey west and encountered the brutal realities of migrant life. But while the characters were fictional, their suffering was very real. Steinbeck had travelled through migrant camps, spoken with families, and documented their lives in searing detail. He was outraged by what he saw: malnutrition, police violence, wage theft, and the erosion of human dignity. His words were not gentle. They were raw, furious, and unflinching. He described babies starving to death, men breaking under humiliation, women doing back-breaking labor while hiding pregnancies. Steinbeck didn't romanticize the poor. He honored them. He saw in them a resilience that refused to die. The novel sparked a firestorm. Some called it un-American. Growers and local officials denounced Steinbeck, accusing him of exaggeration and slander. One California Chamber of Commerce even burned copies of the book, but readers across the country couldn't look away. Suddenly, the faceless Okies had names, stories, and beating hearts. Steinbeck's work did more than raise awareness. It pushed for action. His reporting, combined with the influence of the Grapes of Wrath, helped pressure the federal government to investigate labor abuses and improve conditions for migrants. It brought national attention to a crisis many preferred to ignore. And just as important, it preserved a record. Long after the camps vanished and the winds settled, Steinbeck's story remained. For the children and grandchildren of the Dust Bowl migrants, it became a touchstone, a proof that what their families endured mattered, that their struggle had been seen. In a time when the poor were expected to suffer silently, the Grapes of Wrath shouted. It demanded that the nation listen, and many did. Because sometimes, the most powerful form of resistance isn't a protest sign or a song, it's a story. And Steinbeck told it like no one else could. As the Dust Bowl migrants flooded into California and the American public began to grasp the scale of the disaster, the federal government, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was forced to act. The suffering was simply too visible to ignore. Children were starving, camps were overflowing, fields were filled with desperate laborers, and America's image of itself as the land of opportunity was unraveling in real time. Enter the New Deal, Roosevelt's sweeping series of programs designed to rescue the country from the Great Depression. While the New Deal didn't solve every problem migrants faced, it marked a turning point. Agencies like the Resettlement Administration and later the Farm Security Administration, FSA, were created to offer aid, restore dignity, and attempt long-term solutions. The FSA, in particular, focused on the plight of displaced rural families. It built government-run labor camps in California and other states, structured communities with clean water, toilets, medical care, schools, and even playgrounds. These camps weren't luxurious, but to families who had slept in ditches and roadside tents, they were sanctuaries. Residents elected their own leaders and handled disputes internally, creating some of the only democratic spaces these families had ever known. The camps also became cultural havens. There were libraries, music events, even classes in English and farming. For many, they were places where a new kind of rural American identity began to take shape, one that valued self-governance, solidarity, and pride. Outside the camps, the New Deal offered jobs through the Works Progress Administration, WPA, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, although these were often hard to access for transient migrants. But one of the most lasting contributions came not in dollars, but in documentation. Under the FSA's direction, a team of photographers, including Dorothea Lange, was sent to capture the human cost of the crisis. Her haunting photo, Migrant Mother, became an instant symbol of Dust Bowl-era suffering. It gave the faceless a face. It gave the ignored a voice. Still, not all relief efforts reached everyone. Racism, red tape, and local resistance often excluded the very people who needed help the most. Yet for many families, the New Deal wasn't just a policy. It was a lifeline. It was proof that the government, at last, was trying to listen. And for once, help came before it was too late. By the late 1930s, many Dust Bowl migrants were no longer just surviving. They were organizing. Years of exploitation, broken promises, and dehumanizing labor conditions had pushed them to a tipping point. What began as quiet grumbling in the fields grew into a movement. A wave of strikes, boycotts, and labor protests swept through California's agricultural valleys as migrants demanded better wages, safer conditions, and basic human dignity. It was a dangerous gamble. Growers were powerful. They had money, political connections, and the police on their side. Striking workers were often arrested, beaten, or run out of town. Some were blacklisted from future employment. Others were attacked by hired enforcers. But despite the risk, the workers stood their ground. Organizations like the Cannery and Agricultural Workers Industrial Union and the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America, UCAPAWA, began to emerge, offering a rare but essential support system. Though often underfunded and fragmented, these unions helped teach workers how to negotiate, how to protest peacefully, and how to document abuses. For many migrants, especially women, joining a strike wasn't just about money. It was about voice. Mothers marched with children in their arms. Teenage daughters stood beside fathers in picket lines. In some camps, entire families were evicted for trying to unionize, yet the courage remained. In 1933 and 1934, massive cotton strikes broke out across the San Joaquin Valley. Thousands walked off the job. While growers tried to break the momentum with intimidation and violence, the strike gained national attention. And after long weeks of protest, workers won a modest pay increase, proof that resistance could work. Journalists and writers documented these uprisings. Photographers captured images of tired but defiant picketers. Labor organizers like Luisa Moreno and Dolores Huerta, though their most famous work would come later, stood on the shoulders of these early migrant movements. The Dust Bowl refugees weren't just poor, desperate people. They were political actors, survivors, fighters. Even as their accents marked them as outsiders and their clothes betrayed their poverty, they refused to be silenced. They were no longer just victims of weather and economics. They were now shaping the narrative. In standing up for themselves, they began to change not just their own lives, but the future of labor in America. And their fight was just beginning. By the early 1940s, the worst of the Dust Bowl had passed. Rain finally returned to the plains. The economy, bolstered by the demands of World War II, began to recover. Many migrant families who had once wandered from field to field found permanent homes, steady work, and a fragile sense of normalcy. But the migration had already left a deep, irreversible mark on American society, culturally, politically, and emotionally. The children who once picked fruit under a blazing sun grew up to serve in the military, attend college through the GI Bill, and raise families of their own. Some became farmers again, this time with greater respect for conservation and the land. Others moved to cities like Los Angeles and Bakersfield, laying the foundation for working-class neighborhoods that still exist today. Culturally, the Dust Bowl migration reshaped California. Once seen as outsiders, Okies gradually became part of the fabric of the state. Their music, language, and values blended with local traditions, giving rise to new genres, like the Bakersfield sound in country music, made famous by artists like Merle Haggard, himself the son of migrants. The pain and pride of those years never vanished. They just found new ways to speak. In literature, The Grapes of Wrath became a permanent fixture on American bookshelves, a reminder of both the nation's cruelty and its capacity for compassion. In politics, the Dust Bowl era helped fuel the labor rights movement, land conservation efforts, and broader awareness of the need for a social safety net. The lessons weren't just historical, they were environmental. The Dust Bowl taught America the danger of abusing the land. Soil conservation districts were established, farming techniques were reformed, and ecological stewardship became a national conversation. The wounds left by reckless agriculture were deep, but not forgotten. And perhaps the most enduring legacy was that of resilience. These migrants had faced nature's wrath, economic collapse, hunger, and hate. They had been spat on, shut out, and shoved aside. But they endured, they adapted, and they helped build the modern West. Today, descendants of Dust Bowl migrants still carry the stories of hardship and grit. In dusty family albums, in old camp photos, in the chords of a Guthrie song, they remember. Because the Dust Bowl wasn't just a disaster, It was a defining chapter of American identity. One written in dust, yes, but also in determination.
Imagine a world with no paper, no books, no Google, just memory and voice. That was the reality for nearly all human societies for most of our existence. Long before alphabets were carved into stone or ink flowed onto parchment, knowledge was preserved in stories, songs, and spoken rituals. Oral tradition wasn't just a method of sharing information. It was the primary engine of civilization itself. In these societies, memory was a sacred duty. Stories weren't told for entertainment alone. They were the vessels of identity, law, morality, and survival. Elders passed on creation myths, ancestral lineages, laws, customs, and taboos. Farmers learned planting cycles from seasonal chants. Hunters remembered terrain through rhythmic recitations. Parents taught children life lessons through fables and parables. Everything essential, who we are, where we come from, how to live, was carried in the voice. Because there was no written backup, accuracy mattered. Oral cultures developed sophisticated memory techniques to preserve knowledge. Rhythm, rhyme, meter, repetition. These weren't stylistic choices. They were mnemonic devices. Stories had structure for a reason. Chants and epics were designed to be unforgettable, and they had to be. In a world where the past lived only in minds and mouths, forgetting wasn't just a lapse, it was a cultural crisis. But oral tradition was never static. It was flexible, responsive. Each retelling carried a pulse of the present. A storyteller might adjust a tale for a new audience, or shift emphasis depending on context. This made oral knowledge both enduring and adaptable, a living, breathing archive. It wasn't stored on dusty shelves. It walked, talked, danced, and sang. Storytellers themselves held immense social power. In many cultures, they were revered. They weren't just performers. They were memory keepers, truth bearers. In some places, they were spiritual guides or political advisors. In others, they held the sole responsibility for preserving centuries of wisdom. Losing a master storyteller could mean losing a nation's history. In the absence of written words, societies didn't descend into ignorance. They found other ways to thrive. Oral tradition ensured continuity across generations. It stitched time together. It connected the dead to the living, the individual to the community, the past to the future. And in many corners of the world, it still does. In the heart of West Africa, history walks and talks. It sings. It remembers. It lives in the voice of the griot, a figure who is at once historian, storyteller, musician, genealogist, diplomat, and spiritual guide. In societies stretching from Mali to Senegal to Guinea, griots have preserved centuries of memory without ever writing a single word. The role of the griot isn't just cultural, it's essential. For the Mande peoples and others, griots are keepers of oral archives, entrusted with the collective knowledge of clans, lineages, and empires. They know who married whom, who fought which war, what treaties were signed, and what legends lie behind every village name. A griot can recount a genealogy that spans dozens of generations, recited without hesitation. This isn't casual storytelling. Griots undergo years, sometimes decades, of intense apprenticeship. From a young age, they are trained to memorize thousands of lines of verse, master complex melodies on traditional instruments like the kora, and understand the historical, political, and spiritual weight behind each word. Knowledge is passed down orally, from master to apprentice, generation to generation. Griots often serve at royal courts, advising kings and chiefs. When a ruler makes a major decision, whether to go to war, marry into a rival clan, or forge an alliance, it's the griot who offers historical precedent, reminding leaders of past mistakes or ancient promises. In this sense, griots are not only entertainers but moral anchors. Their role helps ensure continuity, legitimacy, and wisdom in leadership. Even today, in the digital age, griots remain influential. They perform at weddings,
funerals, naming ceremonies, and national events. Their stories remind communities of who they are and what they've overcome. Griots hold power through voice, an ability to preserve unity and identity across centuries of change. When colonialism threatened to erase African history by disregarding oral sources, griots stood as a living rebuke. They proved that memory could endure outside of paper, and that oral tradition was not primitive, but profound. In fact, much of what we know today about empires like Mali or Songhai comes not from colonial records, but from griots who never stopped singing. They are walking libraries, living time machines, and without them, vast stretches of African history would have vanished. Thousands of years before compasses or GPS, the peoples of the Pacific Ocean were already master navigators. From tiny canoes, they charted one of the largest expanses of water on Earth, sailing from island to island across thousands of miles. They had no maps, no written instructions. Instead, they had oral tradition, a deep, embodied knowledge passed from one generation to the next, preserved not in books, but in the blood and bones of memory. At the heart of this tradition were the wayfinders, highly trained navigators who used the stars, ocean swells, cloud formations, bird flight patterns, and even the color of the water to find their way. This knowledge wasn't guesswork. It was precise, tested over generations of voyaging, but it wasn't written down. It was memorized through chants, songs, and visualizations, taught over many years in sacred training. One of the most famous examples of this oral memory system is the star compass, used by Polynesian navigators. This mental map divided the horizon into specific points aligned with the rising and setting of stars. Each star had meaning, direction, and seasonal timing. Wayfinders would chant these stars in a sequence, imprinting entire navigational routes into their minds like a living GPS. The knowledge didn't stop with astronomy. Navigators memorized sequences of islands, stories of past voyages, ocean swells, seasonal winds, and oral genealogies of their own lineages, because navigation wasn't just about travel, it was about identity. To sail the ocean was to trace the steps of your ancestors, to renew your connection to them with every voyage. Oral tradition also safeguarded cultural history. Myths of great migrations, origin stories, and the deeds of legendary seafarers were recited with reverence. These tales weren't just entertainment. They were survival manuals. They told when and where to travel, where fresh water could be found, what reefs to avoid, and what omens to heed. When European explorers arrived in the Pacific, they marveled at the accuracy of these navigators. Some dismissed their knowledge as luck or instinct, but centuries later, modern researchers began to rediscover the immense cognitive sophistication behind it. Today, Polynesian voyaging societies are reviving these oral traditions, training new generations in the art of wayfinding without technology. Because in Polynesia, to remember is to navigate, to speak is to sail, and to forget is to be lost at sea. Long before the written word carved its place in Greek culture, bards travelled from town to town, reciting epic tales that would define Western literature. Among these storytellers was a name that echoed through millennia: Homer. Whether he was a single historical figure or a composite of many voices, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are towering testaments to the power of oral tradition. These weren't simply stories, they were living performances. Recited aloud, often accompanied by the lyre, Homeric epics were transmitted from bard to bard, memorized in their entirety. The Iliad alone contains over 15,000 lines of verse. How could one possibly remember it all? The answer lies in the architecture of oral composition, formulaic language, repetition, epithets like rosy-fingered dawn or swift-footed Achilles. These repeated phrases weren't just poetic flourishes, they were memory aids, cues embedded in the narrative to help the performer stay on track. This method of oral composition allowed for flexibility. No two recitations were ever exactly the same. A bard could expand or shorten the story depending on the audience, weaving in local heroes or emphasizing different emotional beats. In this way, oral tradition allowed the epics to remain relevant, reshaped by each generation, even as their core remained intact. Homeric epics were more than entertainment. They were moral instruction, historical memory, and collective identity. Through the stories of Troy and Odysseus, Greek audiences absorbed lessons on honor, loyalty, cunning, fate, and the will of the gods. The performances bound communities together, reinforcing shared values and reminding listeners of their place in the tapestry of myth and memory. Even after the invention of writing, Homer's works continued to be performed aloud for centuries. The Greeks eventually committed the epics to text, but by then they had already left their imprint on Greek thought, education, and religion. They became cornerstones of classical learning, recited in schools and echoed in the works of philosophers and playwrights. The survival of Homer's tales is a triumph of the oral world. They weren't etched in stone, yet they endured longer than many civilizations. They remind us that human memory, when nurtured and structured, can rival the permanence of books. Because in ancient Greece, to recite Homer wasn't just to tell a story, it was to hold history in your breath. Long before European contact, the indigenous peoples of North America had built rich, complex civilizations without the use of written language. Their histories, laws, cosmologies, and scientific knowledge were preserved entirely through oral tradition. For these communities, spoken word was not merely a method of communication, it was a sacred force. Stories were not just told, they were shared, passed like ceremonial objects, with reverence and responsibility. Each nation, whether the Haudenosaunee, Lakota, Navajo or Hopi, had its own oral systems, suited to its landscape, cosmology and social structure. Creation stories explained not just how the world began, but how humans were meant to live within it. Animal fables taught values like respect, courage, and humility. Historical narratives preserved records of migration, warfare, treaties, and contact with outsiders. These stories were often told during winter, when families gathered in longhouses or around fire circles, reinforcing identity and kinship. The storytellers, often elders or spiritual leaders, were chosen not just for their memory, but for their integrity. They had to be exact. Embellishment wasn't encouraged unless it served a ritual purpose. Many stories had strict patterns, sacred sequences, and proper openings. A story mistold wasn't just inaccurate, it was disrespectful. Beyond history and myth, oral tradition also preserved practical knowledge. Indigenous fire ecology, agricultural systems, astronomical tracking, and herbal medicine were passed orally across centuries. The knowledge of when to plant, where to hunt, how to interpret the stars, or what plants healed wounds. This wasn't written in manuals. It was spoken from elder to youth, often in the form of story, song, or ceremony. Even diplomacy was rooted in oral memory. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, one of the world's oldest participatory democracies, relied on oral recitation of its great law of peace, an epic constitution preserved through wampum belts and ceremonial speech, not parchment. When European colonists arrived, they often dismissed oral culture as inferior, not realizing they were speaking to societies with deep intellectual and legal traditions. In many communities today, that spoken world survives. Despite centuries of forced assimilation and cultural erasure, Indigenous elders still pass on songs, names, and wisdom. Some tribes are revitalizing endangered languages by reviving storytelling ceremonies, knowing that when language dies, stories die too. But as long as a voice remains, memory survives. And through it, nations endure. Long before holy books were bound in leather and placed on altars, the sacred moved through speech. In nearly every major religious tradition, the earliest teachings were carried not on scrolls but in the human voice, recited, memorized, and preserved by devoted followers. Oral tradition wasn't just a method of communication in these faiths, it was the very vehicle of revelation. Take Hinduism, one of the oldest continuous religions on earth. The Vedas, Hinduism's foundational texts, were transmitted orally for centuries before being written down. Sanskrit priests known as pandits or Brahmins were trained from childhood to memorize vast volumes of text, down to every syllable and intonation. The Vedas weren't just words, they were sounds believed to hold cosmic power. Accuracy was essential. Mispronunciation could distort the spiritual effect. And so, oral recitation was treated with precision, rhythm, and reverence. In Islam, the Quran is considered by believers to be the literal word of God as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, not written, but recited. Even today, millions of Muslims memorize the Quran in its entirety, a practice known as becoming a hafiz. The oral tradition here isn't a supplement to the text, it's central. The melodic cadence of Quranic recitation, passed from teacher to student, sustains spiritual meaning and connects the listener to centuries of unbroken transmission. Christianity also began as an oral tradition. The stories of Jesus, the parables, the early miracles, they were shared aloud in gatherings before the Gospels were ever written. Early Christian preachers travelled from village to village, speaking to crowds, debating, converting. Even after the New Testament was compiled, most congregants couldn't read. Faith was still heard, not read. Psalms were sung. Sermons were preached. Scripture lived in ears before eyes. In Judaism, oral tradition forms the backbone of rabbinic teaching. The Mishnah and Talmud, key texts of Jewish law and interpretation, were initially preserved through complex oral chains of transmission. Rabbis debated and discussed teachings aloud, often committing thousands of lines to memory before anything was committed to ink. Across faiths, oral tradition ensured that the divine remained living, dynamic, spoken, and sung. Even today, believers continue these practices. Scripture is chanted, prayers are recited, mantras are whispered. Because for the faithful, the sacred isn't just what's written, it's what's heard, it's what's remembered, and it lives in the human breath. Long before modern courtrooms and printed legal codes, communities across the world upheld complex systems of law through oral tradition. Justice wasn't dispensed by reading from a book, it was spoken, memorized, and performed. In these societies, legal knowledge was a living memory, carried by elders, chiefs, judges, and councils, who ensured that fairness, obligation, and punishment were remembered and respected. Among the Gaelic Browns of Ireland, justice was entirely oral for centuries. The Brehon Laws, a detailed and intricate set of legal principles governing everything from land disputes to honour debts, were transmitted by trained legal scholars who memorized thousands of verses and precedents. These judges didn't carry books, they carried legacy. They recited decisions with precise language, referencing past judgments and using poetic form to aid memory and preserve consistency. In sub-Saharan Africa, many societies relied on elders and councils to enact justice through oral systems. In the Igbo, Zulu, or Ashanti traditions, legal matters were resolved in public gatherings, where testimony was spoken, witnesses recounted events, and judgments were issued through consensus. The absence of writing didn't mean a lack of structure. Memory was the law, elders were the archives, and the spoken word held full authority. Similarly, indigenous communities in North America used oral justice systems to resolve conflict and maintain harmony. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy relied on condolence ceremonies and consensus-based decision-making guided by the Great Law of Peace, a constitution transmitted orally and reinforced through wampum belts, beaded mnemonic tools. Laws were often embedded in stories, myths, and metaphors, reinforcing values like reciprocity, respect, and responsibility. These oral systems were not rigid, they were adaptable. They could evolve with changing times, incorporating new realities without needing to revise written codes. This flexibility made oral law dynamic, deeply embedded in community life, and often more restorative than punitive. When colonial powers imposed written legal systems, many oral law traditions were dismissed as primitive or inferior, but they were anything but. They were community-centered, historically informed, and designed to maintain social balance, not merely enforce state power. Today, some of these oral legal systems are being revived and honoured. In places like New Zealand and Canada, Traditional justice models are being integrated into formal systems, not because they're quaint, but because they work. Because in oral law, justice isn't something you read, it's something you hear, something you remember, and something your whole community understands. At the heart of every oral tradition lies a human being, the storyteller. More than just a narrator, the storyteller is a performer, a teacher, and a guardian of cultural memory. Whether standing before a royal court or sitting by a village fire, they use voice, gesture, rhythm, and emotion to transform memory into living experience. In oral societies, storytelling isn't just an act, it's an art form with structure, training, and purpose. Memory is the storyteller's greatest tool, but this isn't memory as most people know it. Storytellers often train from childhood, absorbing tales word for word, gesture for gesture, tone for tone. They learn through apprenticeship, listening to masters for years before ever telling a story themselves. Precision matters. The wrong detail can twist a sacred myth or misrepresent a lineage. And yet, flexibility is also part of the craft. A master storyteller knows how to adjust timing, tone, or content to suit different audiences, moments, or emotional atmospheres. Across cultures, performance is central. In Japan, rakugo performers sit on stage with only a fan and a cloth, bringing entire casts of characters to life through changes in pitch, facial expression, and timing. In India, the Kathakal tradition combines dance, mime, and song to retell ancient epics like the Mahabharata. In West Africa, griots use instruments like the kora to accompany their recitations, turning history into melody. Storytelling, then, isn't static. It's theatre with memory as its script. The audience is never passive. In oral cultures, storytelling is communal. Listeners gasp, laugh, respond. They know the tales, but come to hear them again, for how they're told matters as much as what is told. A familiar myth can feel new, fresh, even revelatory, depending on the teller's skill. Importantly, storytelling is not entertainment alone. It's education, history, ritual, law, and survival. A story may teach a child what plants are poisonous. It may encode directions across a desert, or rules about kinship and taboo. Often, the lesson is buried in metaphor, understood only with maturity. The storyteller is thus a cultural cornerstone. When they speak, they echo generations. They don't just remember the past, they embody it. Because in oral tradition, memory doesn't live in books, it lives in people. And when they speak, entire civilizations speak with them. In a world ruled by screens, algorithms, and cloud storage, it might seem like oral tradition has faded into the background. But in truth, it's not dying, it's evolving. The digital age, far from erasing spoken heritage, has given it new platforms, new audiences, and new power. Memory, voice, and story are once again central, not just in ancient rituals, but in podcasts, spoken word poetry, voice notes, and viral videos. The medium has changed, but the human impulse remains the same, to remember through voice. Social media, ironically, has brought us back to something ancient. TikTok creators tell modern parables in 60 seconds. YouTubers revive myths and folktales for millions. Podcasts have become the new campfires, where people gather, through headphones instead of hearths, to hear stories that move, teach, or entertain. And in many indigenous and marginalized communities, digital tools are now being used to record elders, revive languages, and archive oral history before it's lost. Technology is also empowering cultures once ignored. Smartphone recordings of grandmothers telling ancestral stories, or children learning tribal songs, are being shared across continents. Entire archives of oral knowledge are now stored online, searchable and shareable. What was once locked in a single storyteller's memory can now be accessed by thousands, with the press of a button. Yet this raises important questions. What happens when oral tradition is frozen into a digital file? Can a recorded story carry the same energy, nuance, or spiritual weight as a live performance? Will future generations still know how to listen, respond, and feel a story in their bones, not just their ears? The digital world gives oral tradition permanence, but also detaches it from the living exchange that once defined it. A story told face-to-face carries gestures, emotion, silence, and community. It is shaped by the mood of the room, the age of the listener, the time of night. Can a story still breathe in a digital archive? The answer may lie in balance. Oral tradition doesn't have to vanish in the face of modernity. It can blend with it. Podcasts can preserve memory. Live-streamed storytelling can unite global audiences. What matters is not the format, but the intention. Because as long as people speak, and others listen, oral tradition survives. Not as a relic, but as a living bridge between past and future. And its next chapter is being written with voice, not ink. More. Tucked deep within Egypt's western desert, beyond dunes that roll like waves and sun-bleached rocks that shimmer under a brutal sun, lies the Siwa Oasis, a place of improbable life and ancient mystery. Surrounded on all sides by arid desolation, Siwa is a mirage made real. Cool freshwater springs, groves of date palms, and olive trees where there should be none. But its true claim to fame is not its beauty or its isolation. It's the divine voice that once echoed from its sands. Here, at this remote outpost near the borderlands of Egypt and Libya, stood the temple of the Oracle of Amun, a sacred sanctuary dedicated to one of Egypt's highest gods. Amun wasn't just a deity of the Nile. His influence extended across empires, merging with the sun god Ra to become Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. But Siwa's oracle wasn't just a religious outpost. It was a spiritual beacon, a place where men came not to worship blindly, but to ask questions of fate and receive answers. Unlike the colossal temples of Thebes or Karnak, the temple of Amun at Siwa was modest in size. Built from limestone and mud brick, weathered by centuries of heat and wind, its strength lay in silence and secrecy. The temple was nestled within the town's sandstone cliffs, overlooking the vast sweep of the desert. It felt less like a monument and more like a whisper from the divine, hidden, intimate, powerful. The oracle at Siwa was said to speak through the high priest in trances or ritualistic ceremonies, delivering answers from Amun himself. Those allowed to approach the shrine brought questions of war, succession, and identity. Not just common folk, but pharaohs and conquerors journeyed across the blistering sands, seeking a glimpse of their destiny. What made Siwa different was not just its isolation, it was its independence. Though nominally part of Egypt, the oasis existed in its own rhythm. Its inhabitants spoke a Berber dialect. Its priests were not mere tools of the state. They guarded the oracle with fierce autonomy. The desert itself was a barrier, both literal and spiritual. To reach Siwa was a test of resolve, but to hear the oracle's voice was to receive something few ever did, certainty from the gods, or so it was believed. The oracle of Amun at Siwa wasn't like other oracles. It didn't dwell in the bustling cities of Egypt or the rich temples of the Nile Valley. It existed in silence, surrounded by nothing but dunes and the haunting wind. This isolation gave it mystique and power. People believed that only in such stillness could the gods be heard. The rituals of the oracle were cloaked in secrecy. The high priest, acting as the mouthpiece of Amun, would retreat into the inner sanctum, where only a select few were ever permitted. There, in a chamber heavy with incense and guarded by thick stone walls, he would enter a trance-like state, his voice said to carry the weight of divine wisdom. Questions were asked in hushed tones. Answers, once delivered, were obeyed without challenge. The answers themselves were often cryptic, cloaked in ambiguity, yet full of meaning. Like the Greek oracle at Delphi, the oracle of Siwa rarely spoke in direct terms. Its power lay in suggestion, in offering direction without dictating fate. But unlike Delphi, the Siwan oracle was also deeply intertwined with Egyptian religious cosmology. It wasn't merely a seer. It was a channel of a god who was also king. Pilgrims came from across North Africa and beyond, braving the merciless journey through the western desert to hear the oracle speak. Merchants, generals, tribal leaders, and even kings arrived with offerings, oil, incense, gold, hoping for divine insight into the most difficult choices of their lives. Some came for personal counsel, others came with questions that could determine the fate of nations. The oasis itself aided the mystique. At night the desert grew quiet and impossibly dark, the sky blanketed with stars. The wind through the date palms sounded almost like voices. Visitors would report dreams, visions, or sudden feelings of revelation after their visit. Whether by ritual or suggestion, the experience left a deep impression. But it wasn't just religious seekers who came. Political figures understood the oracle's value. To receive its blessing was to claim legitimacy, not just among locals, but across the Mediterranean world. A prophecy from Siwa could crown a king, justify a war, or forge an empire. And soon, one man would test that very power, carrying with him a question no mortal had yet dared ask. Was he a god, or merely a king? In 331 BCE, a young conqueror rode into the Egyptian desert with a crown on his head and a question in his heart. His name was Alexander of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great. By this point, he had already defeated the Persian Empire in Egypt and had been declared a pharaoh. But titles weren't enough. Alexander sought divine affirmation, not from men, but from gods, and so he turned towards Siwa. The journey was perilous. The path from Memphis to Siwa was not marked on any clear map. It wound through scorching desert, salt flats, and shifting dunes. Greek historians wrote that Alexander and his caravan nearly lost their way, saved only by miraculous signs, ravens guiding their route, or perhaps divine serpents slithering through the sand. Others claimed they were led by rainstorms, extraordinary events in such an arid land. These tales may have been embellished, but they reflect the mythic tone of the entire expedition. Why did Alexander risk so much to reach the temple? The answer lies in his ambition, not just to rule the known world, but to become more than human. Like the pharaohs before him, Alexander wanted divine legitimacy. He believed, or wanted others to believe, that he was not merely the son of Philip of Macedon, but the son of Zeus Ammon, the supreme god of both the Greek and Egyptian pantheons, whose earthly voice whispered from the Siwan temple. When he arrived at the oasis, Alexander was welcomed with great honor. The priests, likely well aware of his power and political reach, received him in the temple's inner sanctum, a rare privilege. What transpired in that meeting remains a mystery. No detailed account exists. But Alexander emerged transformed. Later, when asked what the oracle had told him, he was famously vague. Some sources suggest the oracle addressed him as the son of Zeus. Others say Alexander received a prophecy of victory and divine favor. Whatever the truth, Alexander's behavior changed. He increasingly portrayed himself as a semi-divine figure, commanding loyalty not just as a king, but as a god in human form. The desert had given him more than just an answer. It had given him myth, and myth, once claimed, could move armies, build cities, and reshape empires. The temple had spoken, and Alexander never looked back. The temple of the oracle at Siwa stood at the crossroads of cultures, not just geographically, but spiritually. Its god, Amun, had long reigned as one of Egypt's most powerful deities. But as Greek influence spread into Egypt, Amun underwent a transformation in the minds of the Mediterranean world. He was reborn as Zeus Ammon, a fusion of two supreme gods, Egyptian and Greek, united in the blazing desert of Siwa. This fusion was more than symbolic. It reflected a broader syncretism, the blending of beliefs, images, and rituals that occurred when empires collided. For the Greeks, Zeus was the king of the gods, thunder-wielding, bearded, omnipotent. Amun, for the Egyptians, was the hidden one, unseen, mysterious, the breath behind all creation. He was often depicted with a ram's horns, symbols of virility, power, and divine presence. When Greeks encountered Amun, they recognized a familiar authority and gave him the name Zeus Ammon. At Siwa, this blended identity took on extraordinary weight. The priests there were Egyptian, trained in ancient rites, yet their fame reached the Hellenistic world. For visiting Greeks like Alexander the Great, the oracle of Zeus Ammon represented not only a divine voice, but a bridge between civilizations. If Alexander could be declared the son of Zeus Ammon, he could rule both Greeks and Egyptians with a single divine lineage. The imagery followed him. Coins minted during his reign began to show Alexander adorned with ram's horns, a direct reference to Zeus Ammon and his divine paternity. This wasn't a stylistic flourish, it was a political message. Alexander wasn't just endorsed by the gods, he was of the gods. This claim helped unify a vast empire where religion was as much a tool of rule as sword or law. Zeus Ammon's cult spread beyond Siwa. Temples were built or rebranded in his name across North Africa, Greece, and even parts of Asia. Pilgrims continued to make the trek to Siwa, drawn by the mystique of a god who was both familiar and foreign, both Greek and Egyptian. The temple had become more than a shrine. It was a cosmic junction, where empires, gods, and destinies met. In the echo of its oracle, one could hear the voice not of a single culture, but of a world in transformation. And in that transformation, Zeus Ammon reigned supreme. Unlike the towering pylons of Luxor or the sprawling avenues of Karnak, the temple of the oracle at Siwa was modest in scale, but monumental in meaning. Built into the limestone cliffs of the Akurmi Hill, the structure blended seamlessly into its desert surroundings, almost as if it had emerged from the rock itself. But this wasn't a flaw of grandeur, it was a choice. The temple's power came not from its size, but from its secrecy. Approaching the temple, pilgrims would pass through winding pathways and narrow gates, ascending toward a sanctuary carved into the hill. The complex included a forecourt, a small hall, and finally, the Holy of Holies, the inner chamber where the oracle's voice was said to reside. This final space was off limits to all but the high priest and select individuals, like Alexander. Its simplicity concealed its sanctity. There were no grand statues or golden shrines, only silence and the unseen presence of a god. The temple's design served a purpose, to disorient and humble. The tight corridors and sharp angles forced visitors to slow down, to lower their heads, to move with caution and reverence. In the desert, where vastness and exposure ruled, the temple offered enclosure and stillness. Light barely entered the sanctuary. Incense would have hung heavy in the air. Echoes turned whispers into something otherworldly. Scholars believe the temple may have had roof openings or vents to carry the priest's voice into adjoining rooms, heightening the drama of the oracle's declarations. From the shadows, a god would speak, and listeners would feel awe not because of what they saw, but what they heard. The architecture wasn't just functional, it was ritualistic theatre. Surrounding the temple were other structures, priests' quarters, ritual pools, and sacred gardens fed by natural springs. Even in this arid land, Siwa was blessed with water, adding to the belief that the oasis itself was touched by divine hands. From this sacred hill, one could see the dunes stretching endlessly, a reminder of the temple's isolation and importance. This was not a place for crowds. It was a place for pilgrims, prophets, and kings. A space designed not to impress the eyes, but to stir the soul. And in that still, cloistered chamber, the future could be whispered from stone. As centuries passed and empires shifted, the temple of the oracle at Siwa began to fade, not in legend, but in voice. The divine breath that once stirred the desert winds grew still. By the time the Roman Empire took root in Egypt, the oracle's prominence had begun to wane. What had once been a cosmic crossroads between gods and kings was now a relic of a fading world. There was no single moment when the oracle fell silent. It was a slow unravelling. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his generals fought bitterly over his empire, and the political unity that had given the temple prestige dissolved. Though Zeus Ammon continued to be venerated in name, the pilgrimage to Siwa no longer held the same magnetic pull. Power shifted back to the Nile Valley and to cities like Alexandria, where philosophy and science began to replace oracular faith. The rise of Rome brought new gods, new laws, and new priorities. Roman emperors paid lip service to Egyptian cults, but the centralized bureaucratic religion of the empire left little room for the shadowy ambiguity of oracles. Shrines like Siwa's were increasingly seen as quaint remnants of a mythic past, respected but no longer consulted for matters of state. Then came Christianity. As it spread across Egypt in the early centuries CE, it cast a harsh light on the old pagan ways. By the 4th century, under the Christianized Roman Empire, temples to the ancient gods were being shut down or repurposed. Oracles were denounced as demonic or deceitful. And in this sweeping religious upheaval, the voice of Amun at Siwa, already a whisper, was extinguished. The temple itself fell into disrepair, its stones weathered by time and sandstorms. Priests vanished, rituals ended. The god who once spoke to Alexander and guided kings now stood mute, buried under the sands of history. Travellers still visited, curious about its legacy, but found only silence and ruins. And yet, the story didn't vanish. Siwa became legend, a place spoken of in hushed tones by scholars and dreamers. The temple may have lost its oracle, but it had gained something else. Mystery. In silence, the temple became immortal, not in prophecy, but in memory, not in sound, but in stone. For centuries, the temple of the oracle at Siwa lay hidden from the wider world, buried not under rubble, but under forgetfulness. The oasis remained inhabited, its people living in quiet continuity, but the once sacred temple was no longer a place of pilgrimage. Its walls weathered under relentless desert winds. Its legends, though still told among locals, had faded from global memory. That began to change in the 18th and 19th centuries, when European explorers and scholars, swept up in a wave of curiosity about ancient Egypt, turned their attention to the Western Desert. Siwa was difficult to reach, its isolation protected by harsh terrain and wary tribes. But in 1792, the first documented European, an Englishman named William George Brown, braved the journey. Others followed, drawn by rumours of a lost oracle visited by Alexander the Great. By the early 20th century, archaeologists and historians began surveying the ruins in earnest. The Akhurmi Hill complex was identified as the likely site of the Temple of Amun. Though modest in size, the structure matched descriptions from ancient texts. A central chamber, thick defensive walls, and its vantage point over the surrounding oasis. The temple wasn't grand, but it was exactly where history said it would be. Excavations were limited and cautious. The site had suffered erosion, but some stonework and inscriptions remained. Fragmentary as it was, the architecture spoke volumes. A stone altar, traces of columns, rooms aligned with celestial bodies. Each clue confirmed that this windswept ruin had once held the ear of kings and gods. More than archaeology, it was the mythology of Siwa that drew fascination. The idea that Alexander had stood here, alone in a desert sanctuary, hearing words that would change empires, captured the imagination of generations. Poets, historians, and travellers romanticized the journey, blending fact and legend into a timeless narrative. Today, visitors still come to Siwa, not to consult an oracle, but to feel the echo of its silence. The temple, though worn, remains standing. Its stones are sun-bleached, its walls crumbling, but the air around it still hums with something ancient, something unresolved. Ruins don't need voices to speak. They speak through presence, through mystery. And in Siwa, the stones remember what the world once forgot. Though the temple no longer speaks with the voice of gods, the oasis of Siwa still breathes with life, culture, and memory. Far from being a forgotten outpost, Siwa remains a vibrant, living community, its people guardians of a heritage that stretches back millennia. The oracle may be silent, but the traditions it once inspired still ripple through the town's language, rituals, and rhythms. Siwans speak a distinct Berber dialect, known as Siwi, unique in Egypt and a testament to the oasis's ancient roots. Oral storytelling remains vital, just as it did in the days of the oracle. Elders pass down myths, family histories, and local legends, blending Islamic faith with pre-Islamic customs in subtle ways. Many Siwans still recount tales of Alexander's visit, not from books, but from memory. The architecture of Siwa also preserves echoes of the past. Traditional mud brick buildings, cool in the searing desert heat, line the town, and the ruined fortress of Shali, built from salt and clay, still towers over the oasis like a ghost of another age. The design of these structures reflects a continuity of form and function that has resisted change for centuries. Siwa's sacred geography remains powerful. Nearby springs and pools are still venerated. Cleopatra's Pool, a natural spring believed to have been used by the famous queen herself, remains a popular spot for both locals and visitors. Rituals tied to fertility, harvest, and healing still occur, many layered with Islamic prayers but rooted in older traditions. Even marriage festivals, like the annual celebration at Gebel Dakrur, preserve elements of Siwa's spiritual past. Families gather, songs echo, and matches are made, not unlike the ancient gatherings once held at the temple, where people sought guidance not only for war and kingship, but for life itself. In the modern age, Siwa has become a quiet pilgrimage site of a different kind, not for prophecy, but for peace. Travelers seeking escape from the noise of modernity come here to walk the palm groves, soak in the desert silence, and reflect on a time when gods spoke from stone. Siwa reminds us that history is not only found in books or beneath the ground, it lives in people, in custom, in memory. And through them, the oracle still murmurs, not in thunder, but in whispers. The temple of the oracle at Siwa may no longer stand in its full glory, but its legacy endures, in myth, in memory, and in the minds of those who seek meaning beyond what is written. For centuries, its voice guided kings and comforted pilgrims. Its silence today only deepens its mystique. Few places in the ancient world held such a profound air of sacred uncertainty, a space where questions were heavier than answers, and silence could feel divine. Siwa's oracle lives on not in revived rituals, but in the stories we continue to tell. Alexander the Great's visit remains one of history's most compelling crossroads. A mortal man, surrounded by sand, seeking to confirm that he was more than human. Whether the oracle truly declared him a god, or merely allowed him to believe it, the outcome was the same. Destiny was shaped. The enduring fascination with Siwa comes from this fusion of history and myth. It asks us timeless questions. Can men become gods? Can destiny be revealed? Does the voice of truth ever speak plainly, or only in riddles? And perhaps most importantly, do we still listen for those whispers? Modern seekers visit the ruins not with questions of empire or conquest, but for clarity, for stillness, for presence. The desert remains vast and unmoved, the temple crumbling but magnetic. The same sun that scorched Alexander's caravan now warms curious travelers. The same silence that once surrounded the Holy of Holies still envelops the broken walls. Siwa invites reflection, not because it gives answers, but because it has always honored the asking. The oracle, like all ancient voices, was never about fortune-telling. It was about direction, affirmation, possibility. The journey across the sands was never just a physical trial. It was a ritual of transformation. You didn't just arrive at the temple. You became someone else along the way. Today, as we face our own deserts of meaning, identity, and purpose, perhaps the oracle still has something to offer. Not a booming voice from the past, but a quiet suggestion in the mind. Who are you, really? And what are you becoming? The temple is dust, the voice is gone, but the question remains, and that, perhaps, was always the true prophecy.